Royal guards searched Camilla's closet and found the late queen's coronation robe best story. The palace had always been a place of quiet elegance, with its high ceilings, golden chandeliers, and long corridors that echoed with history. Every room seemed to carry a story, and every object had its place, carefully preserved by generations of staff and royal attendants. But on this particular morning, there was a tension in the air that had not been there before. The usual calm of the palace was replaced by quiet whispers, hurried footsteps, and the low murmur of anxious voices. Something was missing. It had begun as a simple inventory check, a routine measure to ensure that the priceless belongings of the royal family were all accounted for. Normally, these checks were straightforward. Staff members would go room by room, closet by closet, noting every item: robes, crowns, jewelry, and ceremonial dresses. But this time, the results were unsettling. Several important items, including some of the late queen's most treasured gowns, were unaccounted for. Among these was the coronation robe, a symbol of the late queen's dignity and legacy, a garment that had seen centuries of history and was considered priceless. For many of the palace staff, the disappearance of these items was a cause for quiet concern. Most had devoted decades of their lives to serving the royal family and took great pride in maintaining the sanctity of the palace. Losing such important treasures was not just an administrative oversight, it felt like a personal failure. Rumors began circulating in hushed tones. Some suggested theft, while others whispered about carelessness or misplacement. Every staff member wondered the same thing: how could something so valuable simply vanish? In the midst of this tension, Royal Guard officer Thomas Bennet was called into the private chambers of the palace administration. Bennet was not just any guard. He was known for his keen eye, his patience, and his methodical approach to every task he undertook. Over the years, he had earned a reputation for being meticulous, someone who could be trusted to handle delicate matters without causing alarm or scandal. It was no surprise, then, that he was chosen for the task that lay ahead. As he entered the room where he was to receive his instructions, he noticed the seriousness on the faces of the administrators. Papers were scattered across the desk, lists of inventory meticulously checked and double-checked. They explained to him that a detailed search would need to be conducted, and that it was a sensitive matter. The items missing were not just ordinary garments. They were pieces of history, symbols of the monarchy, and treasures that had survived decades, if not centuries, of change. Any mistake or mishandling could lead to scandal or public outrage. Bennet listened carefully, nodding as he absorbed the instructions. The search would need to be discreet, thorough, and respectful. Some areas of the palace were personal quarters, private spaces that had never been entered by anyone without permission. It was a delicate balance, ensuring the items were found without causing embarrassment or tension. Among the areas mentioned, one location stood out: Camilla's private quarters. The late queen's coronation robe was rumored to be among the possessions in this section of the palace, though no one could confirm it. Camilla, the queen consort, was respected for her poise and dedication, but she was also known to be fiercely protective of her private space. The thought of searching her personal quarters was not taken lightly. Bennet knew that he would need to maintain the utmost professionalism. Every movement, every word, and every action would be scrutinized. One wrong step could lead to misunderstanding or even resentment. But the importance of the task outweighed any discomfort. This was about preserving history, ensuring the royal legacy remained intact, and safeguarding the treasures of the palace for generations to come. As he prepared for the search, Bennet reflected on the responsibility he carried. The palace was more than just a building. It was a living museum, a repository of memory and tradition. The corridors whispered stories of coronations, celebrations, and solemn ceremonies. Every corner held significance, from the gilded picture frames on the walls to the delicate porcelain figurines carefully displayed on shelves. To find a missing artifact here was no simple task. It required patience, focus, and a respect for the weight of history itself. On the morning of the search, Bennett arrived early. The palace was quieter than usual, the air filled with anticipation. Other guards and staff were discreetly stationed nearby, ready to assist if necessary but careful not to intrude. Bennett began by reviewing the layout of Camilla's private quarters, noting the closets, drawers, and storage spaces. He knew that the robe could be anywhere, folded in a drawer, tucked behind other garments, or stored in a hidden compartment. His approach was methodical. He would not rush, nor would he overlook any detail, no matter how small. The first step was to ensure that everything was documented. Bennett carried a notebook and a camera, recording every observation and noting every item he encountered. Each hanger, each box, and each folded garment was examined carefully. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning for anything unusual. The palace had seen many royal garments over the years, some ornate with embroidery, others delicate with lace and silk. But the coronation robe was unique. It had a presence that was unmistakable, a combination of intricate design, historical weight, and ceremonial significance. Hours passed as Bennett continued his search. There were moments of frustration when spaces seemed empty, moments of doubt when nothing appeared out of place. But he reminded himself to remain patient. In the palace, treasures were rarely lost forever. They were often misplaced or hidden away for safekeeping. The key was to stay calm, observe carefully, and trust in the process. Then, as he was examining one of the larger closets, something caught his attention. A section of the closet appeared slightly different from the rest. The garments hung there did not align perfectly, and the panel at the back seemed unusual, almost as if it had been moved recently. Bennett's heart quickened, but he maintained his composure. He signaled to the other guards to remain alert but quiet. Moving closer, he inspected the panel, noting its edges and the subtle seam that suggested it could be opened. With careful hands, he tested the panel. At first, it resisted, but then it shifted, revealing a narrow space behind the hanging garments. The space was hidden, almost as if it had been designed to store something precious and private. Bennett reached inside and felt the texture of heavy, ornate fabric. Pulling it gently, he saw the unmistakable gold embroidery, the delicate patterns, and the deep, regal colors of the coronation robe. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The robe, a symbol of the late Queen's reign, had been found in a place no one had expected. Bennett carefully unfolded it, ensuring that every crease was treated with respect. He took notes, photographed the garment, and made sure it was preserved in its current condition. There was no rush, no excitement beyond the silent satisfaction of having completed the task successfully. Bennett reflected on the discovery as he worked. The robe had a story, a presence that went beyond its fabric and embroidery. It was a piece of history, a reminder of the late Queen's dedication and grace. Finding it in Camilla's closet was unexpected, but it also reminded him that history is often preserved in the most surprising places. Every royal artifact had its journey, and sometimes it took careful attention and patience to ensure that it was never truly lost. As the search continued, Bennett felt a renewed sense of purpose. The palace was more than a building. It was a guardian of stories, memories, and legacies. His role, as a royal guard, was not just to protect the people, but also to protect the history that surrounded them. Each garment, each ornament, each document had value beyond measure, and finding the coronation robe reinforced the importance of vigilance, respect, and dedication in the preservation of heritage. By the end of the morning, the initial tension had eased. The coronation robe was safe, carefully wrapped, and moved to a secure location. Bennett's meticulous approach had ensured that the discovery was handled with discretion and professionalism. The palace staff breathed a collective sigh of relief, grateful that the missing item had been found without incident or misunderstanding. Yet, even as the robe was returned to safety, the palace remained a place of quiet reflection. The discovery reminded everyone that history is fragile and precious, that treasures can be misplaced, and that the dedication of those who protect them is invaluable. Bennett, for his part, felt a deep satisfaction in his role, knowing that his careful attention had preserved a symbol of legacy and honor for future generations to admire and respect. After the initial discovery of the hidden panel in Camilla's closet, Royal Guard Officer Thomas, Bennett knew that the task was far from over. Finding the coronation robe was only the beginning. There were still countless questions to answer, and every moment had to be handled with careful attention. The palace was a delicate ecosystem, where the smallest misstep could cause rumors to spread and tensions to rise. Bennett's mind was focused, his senses alert, and his patience steady. He understood that the next stage of the search would require not just skill but careful observation, subtlety, and respect for privacy. The team of guards and staff who had assisted him earlier now moved in closer, though they maintained a quiet distance. Each member had been briefed to follow strict procedures. Nothing could be touched unnecessarily, everything had to be documented, and no assumptions could be made. There was a mix of anticipation and caution in the air. Everyone was aware of the sensitive nature of the area they were in. Camilla's personal space was private, and any misstep could be interpreted as intrusion. But the missing items were of such historical significance that discretion alone would not suffice. They had to be found. Bennett began the second phase of the search by examining the arrangement of the garments in the closet. Clothes were lined up in an orderly fashion, as if carefully curated by someone who valued precision. Dresses of various styles, colors, and fabrics hung neatly, their folds smooth and tidy. While the coronation robe had been hidden behind a panel, Bennett suspected that other missing items might also be stored in unexpected ways. His method was systematic, row by row, shelf by shelf, box by box. Every item was inspected visually first, without touching anything unnecessarily. Bennett knew that even the smallest mistake could damage a delicate garment. He paused at each piece, observing patterns, textures, and tags that might indicate the garment's origin or historical importance. Some dresses were modern, designed for public appearances or casual events. Others were older, with embroidery that hinted at royal craftsmanship and careful preservation. Each item had a story, and Bennett wanted to understand it before moving anything. As he progressed, Bennett noticed subtle clues that suggested the placement of other items might not be entirely random. Some of the clothing had been slightly rearranged, hangers misaligned, or boxes shifted. These minor inconsistencies indicated that someone had taken care to store items, but perhaps not to catalog them properly. It was a reminder that the palace, despite its grandeur, was also a human environment where mistakes could happen. People moved things, stored them temporarily, and sometimes forgot their exact locations. Bennett's patience was tested as he continued. Hours passed, and the search revealed nothing immediately extraordinary. The team moved quietly, communicating only when necessary. Each time a drawer was opened or a box lifted, there was a careful inspection. Every observation was noted, photographed, and cross-checked with the palace inventory records. The attention to detail was exhaustive, but Bennett knew that one lapse could mean overlooking another priceless artifact. Then came a moment that heightened the tension. A small chest tucked in the corner of the closet drew Bennett's attention. Unlike the rest of the room, it appeared older, with a worn leather surface and brass hinges slightly tarnished by time. He approached it with care, sensing that it might hold something significant. The chest was locked, but the keyhole was small and unassuming. Bennett retrieved a set of palace master keys, each one carefully labeled for authorized access to restricted areas. Slowly and deliberately, he inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open, revealing a collection of gloves, tiaras, and delicate accessories. Among these items were pieces that had been listed in the missing inventory. Each one was carefully examined and documented. Gloves that had been worn during state ceremonies, tiaras used at formal balls, and other delicate accessories were handled with utmost care. Bennett's methodical approach ensured that every item was preserved in its current state and could be properly returned to the archives. The discovery was both relieving and enlightening. It showed that the missing items were not stolen. They had been stored, perhaps forgotten, but intact and safe. Bennett took a moment to reflect on the responsibility he carried. The palace was filled with objects that were not only valuable but also symbolic. Each garment, accessory, and artifact represented a piece of the monarchy's history. Mishandling them could have cultural consequences far beyond the immediate embarrassment of misplacement. He reminded himself that his role was not just about finding items, but about protecting the stories they carried. Every fold of fabric, every delicate stitch, every hidden compartment held meaning. As the search continued deeper into the closet, the guards discovered another hidden area. This one was less obvious, a small panel at the side of a shelving unit that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding woodwork. Bennett's trained eye noticed a slight gap along the edge, a sign that the panel could be opened. With gentle pressure, he moved the panel aside, revealing a small collection of ceremonial robes. Unlike the coronation robe, these were slightly smaller and less ornate, but still significant. Some had been worn during official ceremonies, while others were reserved for special family events within the palace. Bennett and his team worked carefully to remove each item, laying them out on soft, protective cloths. They noted the condition, material, and embroidery of every garment. Photographs were taken, measurements were recorded, and inventory numbers cross-referenced. The level of detail was immense, but it was necessary. The palace's historical legacy depended on accurate documentation and preservation. Even a minor oversight could lead to confusion or disputes in the future. During this process, Bennett began to notice patterns. The items were not randomly stored. Someone had taken care to keep them safe, even if they were not cataloged properly. It seemed likely that previous staff members had placed items in the closet for protection, perhaps during renovations or temporary relocations, and had assumed they would be remembered later. Over time, with staff changes and palace routines, the locations were forgotten, leading to the current confusion. Understanding this helped Bennett remain calm. There was no malicious intent, just human error and the natural challenges of maintaining a complex historic estate. By mid-afternoon, the search had revealed a substantial portion of the missing inventory. Bennett paused to review the findings. The coronation robe remained the centerpiece, a symbol of the late queen's reign and grace. Surrounding it were gloves, tiaras, ceremonial robes, and other delicate garments. Each item had been handled with care, ensuring that its historical value remained intact. The relief among the palace staff was evident. The tension that had filled the corridors that morning had given way to a sense of accomplishment. Yet Bennett knew the work was not finished. Even with these discoveries, thorough documentation was essential. Every item would need to be returned to its proper location in the palace archives, ensuring that future inventories would account for them accurately. He also needed to prepare a detailed report for the palace administration, explaining how the items had been found and providing recommendations to prevent future misplacements. This was not merely administrative. It was about preserving the monarchy's legacy with professionalism and care. As the team concluded the search, Bennett took a final walk through Camilla's closet. Everything was in order, the items carefully organized and documented. The tension had lifted, replaced by a quiet satisfaction. He reflected on the lessons of the day, that history can sometimes be hidden in plain sight, that human error is inevitable but manageable, and that patience, respect, and meticulous attention to detail are essential in safeguarding legacy. Before leaving the quarters, Bennett ensured that the hidden panels were secured, the items properly labeled, and the documentation complete. The palace staff were briefed on the findings, and plans were made to return the items to their official storage spaces. The discovery had been handled with discretion, avoiding unnecessary attention while ensuring that every artifact was accounted for. It was a reminder that even in a world of grandeur and ceremony, careful work behind the scenes is what truly preserves history. As Bennett walked back through the quiet corridors of the palace, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The search had not only recovered priceless items, but had also reinforced the importance of diligence and respect in his role. The palace was more than a residence. It was a living museum, a place where history and memory were preserved for generations. Finding the hidden robes and accessories was a small victory in that larger mission, a reminder that even the most careful guardians must remain vigilant, patient, and attentive to the smallest details. Even after hours of careful searching, Royal Guard Officer Thomas Bennett felt the tension in the air deepen. The hidden panels and secret spaces in Camilla's closet had revealed a surprising number of items: ceremonial gloves, tiaras, and older robes. But Bennett had a sense that the most significant discovery was still ahead. There was a reason why the coronation robe of the late queen had been missing from the palace inventory, and he could feel that the answer was closer than anyone realized. Each movement in the quiet closet seemed amplified: the soft rustle of fabric, the faint creak of the floorboards, the distant echoes of other staff walking the halls. The air was thick with anticipation, a mix of excitement and responsibility. Bennett paused in front of a tall section of the closet, one that he had examined earlier but now seemed different. Sometimes, the mind notices subtle details only after hours of focus. The panel here had a slight misalignment, almost invisible but noticeable to someone trained in observation. The hangers behind it were not perfectly even, and the fabric of a gown pressed against the panel seemed heavier than expected. He crouched down, feeling along the edges, and discovered a thin groove. It was a handle, cleverly hidden in the woodwork. Carefully, he lifted it, revealing a small compartment recessed into the wall. Inside was a sight that made Bennett's heart skip a beat. Carefully folded and resting on soft silk lining was the late queen's coronation robe. Its presence was immediate, almost commanding attention even in the dim light of the closet. The robe was magnificent, made of heavy fabric embroidered with gold thread, each stitch telling a story of royalty, ceremony, and tradition. A long train lay folded neatly beneath the main body of the robe, and the deep colors of velvet, gold, and cream shimmered even in the soft light. This was not just a garment. It was a symbol of decades of monarchy, the very embodiment of the late queen's reign. Bennett took a deep breath, steadying himself. He knew that the discovery was extraordinary, both in its historical significance and the delicate responsibility it carried. For a moment, he allowed himself a sense of quiet awe, thinking of the countless ceremonies, the public appearances, and the solemn moments in which the robe had been worn. To hold something that had witnessed history firsthand was humbling. Yet there was no time for celebration. Everything had to be handled with care, precision, and respect. He carefully reached for the robe, using gloved hands to avoid any contact with bare skin. Each fold was lifted gently, and the garment was examined in detail. The embroidery was immaculate, the gold thread still shining despite decades of use. Small details, like subtle creases and slight fading, told the story of its age and its journey through history. Bennett made notes of its condition, photographed it from multiple angles, and documented every feature. Every action was deliberate, ensuring that nothing could damage the robe or compromise its integrity. The other members of the team watched in silent awe. Even those who had spent years in royal service were struck by the robe's beauty and importance. There was a reverent stillness in the room, as though they were all aware of the gravity of the moment. Bennett reminded them to remain focused, to maintain the highest standards of professionalism. This was not simply a discovery, it was the recovery of a national treasure, an item of immense cultural and historical value. Once the robe was carefully removed from the compartment, Bennett laid it out on a protective cloth, ensuring that its folds were preserved and that no damage occurred. He examined the interior lining, noting its condition, and checked the seams and hems for any signs of wear. Every detail was meticulously recorded. He could feel the weight of history in his hands, and with each observation, he became more aware of the immense responsibility entrusted to him. This was the culmination of days of careful observation, patience, and dedication. As he worked, Bennett reflected on how the robe had ended up in this hidden space. There were no signs of neglect or deliberate concealment with malicious intent. The placement suggested a desire to preserve the garment, to protect it from damage or misplacement. Perhaps it had been stored temporarily during a renovation or for safekeeping during a transition of staff. Whatever the reason, the robe had survived decades in pristine condition, waiting quietly to be rediscovered. It was a reminder that history can sometimes be hidden in plain sight, preserved by careful hands even when forgotten by time. Bennett signaled to his team to prepare for transport. The coronation robe could not remain in the closet, not even temporarily. It needed to be moved to a secure, climate-controlled area where it could be properly preserved. Every step of the process was carefully planned. Protective coverings were laid out, gloves were worn, and the robe was lifted with multiple hands to ensure that no strain or damage occurred. Even the slightest wrinkle or crease had to be avoided. The palace had standards for preservation, and Bennett was determined to meet them perfectly. While the robe was being secured, Bennett also noticed other items tucked behind it. Smaller garments and accessories, perhaps associated with the coronation or other formal events, had been placed in the same compartment. Each item was handled with the same care and attention as the robe itself. The team documented everything, photographing the items, recording measurements, and noting their condition. This was not just about finding the coronation robe. It was about recovering a part of the palace's history that had been temporarily hidden, ensuring that every piece was accounted for. The mood in the closet was one of quiet triumph. The tension that had hung over the palace for days began to lift, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and relief. The discovery of the coronation robe was a success that validated Bennett's meticulous methods and reinforced the importance of patience, observation, and respect in handling royal property. Every member of the team understood the significance of what they had found and the care required to preserve it. After the robe was moved to a secure location, Bennett took a moment to reflect on the process. It had been long, exhausting, and demanding, but it had also been deeply rewarding. The discovery was more than a retrieval of a garment. It was a recovery of a symbol, a piece of history that connected the present to decades of royal tradition. It reminded him that even the smallest details, the hidden corners and overlooked spaces, could hold treasures of immense value. The team then began the process of cataloging the recovered items in full detail. Every measurement, color description, and embroidery pattern was recorded. Notes were taken on potential areas of wear, and recommendations were made for their future preservation. Bennett knew that this documentation would be invaluable not just for immediate reference, but for future generations who would continue to protect and study the palace's historic collection. It was meticulous, time-consuming work, but it was essential. By the late afternoon, the coronation robe and associated items were safely secured. The closet was restored to its orderly condition, and Bennett's team ensured that everything was documented and accounted for. The palace staff, who had anxiously awaited updates, were informed of the successful recovery. Relief and quiet celebration filled the halls. The robe was no longer missing, and the palace could breathe a little easier knowing that a key part of its history had been preserved. Yet even with the success, Bennett remained thoughtful. He knew that this was just one part of a larger process. The recovery of the coronation robe raised questions about palace procedures, the handling of historic items, and how such treasures could be better tracked in the future. The discovery was a reminder that history is fragile, and that careful attention, dedication, and respect are necessary to protect it. It was a responsibility he and his colleagues would continue to carry with diligence and pride. As Bennett walked out of Camilla's quarters, he felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The coronation robe, long hidden and almost forgotten, had been rediscovered, preserved, and protected. It was a moment of triumph, not just for him, but for everyone entrusted with the care of the palace and its treasures. He knew that the story of the discovery would eventually be shared, a reminder of the dedication and vigilance required to safeguard history. And in that quiet palace corridor, Bennett allowed himself a small smile, knowing that history had been preserved, and that the legacy of the late queen remained intact, secure, and respected. After the coronation robe was safely removed from Camilla's closet and secured in a climate-controlled archive, the palace administration faced a new challenge, understanding how such a priceless item could have been misplaced for so long. While the robe had been recovered intact and without damage, questions lingered. How had it ended up in a hidden compartment? Who had placed it there? And why had it gone unrecorded for so many years? For the palace staff, the answers were important not only for historical accuracy, but also for maintaining trust, accountability, and the reputation of the royal household. Royal Guard officer Thomas Bennett was once again called to the administration office, this time not to conduct a search, but to provide a detailed report of the discovery. He carefully explained every step of the process, how he had noticed subtle inconsistencies in the closet, discovered the hidden panels, and handled the coronation robe with care. He also noted the other items he had found, smaller ceremonial garments, gloves, and tiaras, describing their condition, placement, and significance. The administrators listened intently, taking notes and asking precise questions to ensure every detail was captured. With Bennett's report in hand, the palace administration decided that a discreet investigation was necessary. There was no evidence of wrongdoing, yet the absence of such a valuable item from official records for so long raised concerns. The goal was not to assign blame, but to understand the circumstances fully and prevent future misplacements. Investigators were assigned to review historical records, security logs, and staff reports from previous years. The investigation needed to be thorough, yet careful, so that it did not disturb the delicate dynamics of the palace. The first step involved speaking with current and former staff members who had worked closely with Camilla's quarters. These individuals were interviewed in a professional, respectful manner. Investigators asked about past storage practices, any renovations or relocations that may have occurred, and whether anyone remembered handling the coronation robe or other missing items. Most staff members were surprised that such an important garment had been misplaced, but many recalled instances where items had been temporarily moved during cleaning, redecorating, or special events. These memories were fragmented, but together they painted a picture of human error rather than malicious intent. Bennett himself provided valuable insight. His careful documentation during the search revealed subtle clues that helped investigators understand how the robe had ended up behind the hidden panel. For example, the alignment of the hangers, the weight of the garments pressing against the wall, and the slight variations in fabric arrangement all suggested that someone had deliberately stored the robe for safekeeping. It appeared that the intention had been protective rather than secretive. The hidden compartment itself was well designed, likely intended to preserve delicate items from dust, light, or accidental handling. Investigators then turned to historical records, reviewing notes from previous inventories, staff logs, and renovation documents. These records confirmed that several items had been temporarily relocated over the years, often for practical reasons such as renovations or reorganizations of storage areas. It became clear that the coronation robe had been placed in Camilla's closet decades ago as a precaution. However, due to staff changes and lapses in documentation, the exact location had been forgotten. Over time, the wardrobe and panel had become almost invisible, blending into the surroundings and evading detection during routine checks. Security footage and photographic archives were also examined. Investigators looked for any evidence of unauthorized access or unusual activity in Camilla's quarters. None was found. There were no signs of tampering or attempts to remove the garment without permission. Instead, the evidence pointed to careful, well-intentioned storage that had simply been forgotten. This discovery reassured the administration that the palace's historic items remained safe and that no deliberate wrongdoing had occurred. The investigation also involved reviewing the cataloging process for royal garments. Staff were trained to maintain meticulous records, but over decades, changes in personnel, technology, and procedures had created gaps. Some older items had been recorded in handwritten ledgers, while newer inventories relied on digital databases. The coronation robe had fallen between these systems, a victim of transitional record keeping. Understanding this helped the administration develop plans to improve tracking, ensuring that all items, past, present, and future, would be accounted for. Once investigators were confident in their findings, they prepared a report for the palace. The report emphasized that the robe's disappearance was not the result of theft or negligence, but of historical oversight. It highlighted the importance of careful documentation, ongoing staff training, and periodic audits to prevent future lapses. The administrators also noted the value of Bennett's careful approach during the search, crediting his observation skills, patience, and respect for protocol in ensuring the robe was recovered without damage or controversy. As part of the follow-up, the palace decided to implement new measures. Hidden compartments and unusual storage spaces would be checked more thoroughly during inventories. Staff would receive updated training on documenting temporary relocations, and regular audits would be conducted to cross-check physical items with digital records. The goal was not only to safeguard the royal collection, but also to honor the legacy of the late queen by ensuring her historic items remained visible, accessible, and properly preserved. Meanwhile, Bennett reflected on the investigation and the lessons it offered. He realized that maintaining a palace of this size and historical significance required constant vigilance. Human error was inevitable, but careful processes and attentive staff could prevent small oversights from becoming major problems. The coronation robe incident became a case study in the palace, demonstrating how history could be preserved even when errors occurred, provided that diligence and respect guided every action. In addition to procedural improvements, the palace took steps to communicate the findings carefully. While the coronation robe's discovery was significant, it was important to avoid sensationalism or misunderstanding. Public statements emphasized that the robe had been recovered safely, that there was no evidence of wrongdoing, and that the palace was taking steps to prevent future misplacements. The messaging was clear, respectful, and measured, reflecting the dignity of the institution and the importance of transparency without creating scandal. The investigation also had a personal impact on staff. Many felt reassured that their work was valued and that mistakes could be addressed constructively. They were reminded that the preservation of history was a collective responsibility, requiring patience, attention, and respect for the past. Bennett's example inspired others, showing that careful observation, methodical action, and a calm approach could resolve even the most perplexing situations. As the days passed, the palace returned to its usual rhythm, but the coronation robe remained a focal point of care and attention. It had been rediscovered, preserved, and returned to its rightful place, and the lessons learned ensured that its history would remain protected. The investigation, though discreet, had strengthened procedures, reinforced trust, and highlighted the importance of vigilance in safeguarding heritage. Through it all, Bennett remained quietly proud. He knew that his meticulous work, combined with the thoughtful investigation, had preserved a symbol of the late Queen's reign. The coronation robe, once hidden and almost forgotten, was now secure, its legacy intact. He understood that history was fragile, and that even the most valuable treasures could be misplaced if human attention wavered. Yet he also knew that with care, diligence, and respect, those treasures could be recovered and preserved for generations to come. By the end of the investigation, the palace administration felt confident that all missing items had been accounted for. The coronation robe had been found, and smaller ceremonial items were documented and secured. Staff were reassured, procedures improved, and the palace could move forward knowing that history was safe in their hands. The experience became a lesson in responsibility, patience, and the importance of protecting heritage, reminding everyone that the treasures of the past are preserved not just by chance, but through careful attention and unwavering dedication. With the coronation robe finally secured and the palace investigation completed, life in the royal residence began to return to its usual rhythm. The corridors, once filled with quiet tension and whispers about the missing items, now carried a calm and orderly energy. Staff moved with confidence, reassured that the palace's treasures were safe, and the late Queen's legacy remained protected. For Royal Guard officer Thomas Bennett, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that his careful attention and patience had helped resolve one of the most delicate situations the palace had faced in years. Despite the relief, there was also a sense of reflection. The discovery of the coronation robe and the other hidden items had reminded everyone that the palace was not just a residence, it was a living repository of history. Every garment, accessory, and artifact told a story. Each piece was a witness to decades of ceremonies, celebrations, and solemn occasions. Bennett often thought about the moments the robe had seen, the coronation day itself, the cheers of the public, the solemn oaths, and the weight of responsibility on the late Queen's shoulders. Holding that piece of history in his hands had been a humbling experience, one that reminded him why his role carried such significance. The palace administration decided to strengthen procedures to prevent similar situations in the future. Staff received updated training in documenting, handling, and storing valuable historical items. Regular audits were scheduled, ensuring that all items from the most delicate gloves to the most elaborate robes would be accounted for and preserved. Bennett played a key role in developing these procedures, sharing insights from his own observations during the search and recovery process. His experience highlighted the importance of combining patience, careful observation, and methodical action when dealing with historical treasures. In addition to practical improvements, the palace also reflected on the human side of the story. The coronation robe had been misplaced not due to negligence or theft, but because of natural lapses in memory over decades and changes in staff. This realization helped ease any tension or embarrassment that might have arisen. Staff members felt reassured that mistakes could be corrected, and that history could be preserved with thoughtful care rather than fear of reprimand. Bennett emphasized the importance of vigilance without judgment, ensuring that the focus remained on preservation and learning rather than blame. The coronation robe itself became a symbol not only of the late Queen's reign, but also of the palace's resilience and dedication to its history. Carefully cleaned, maintained, and stored in climate-controlled conditions, the robe was now easier to access for historical study and public display when appropriate. Conservators praised the careful handling during the recovery process, noting that Bennett's methodical approach had prevented any damage. For the palace, this was a victory. An important artifact had been recovered intact, and lessons learned from the experience would ensure that future generations could appreciate its historical significance. Camilla, the queen consort, also expressed her thoughts about the discovery. She conveyed respect and admiration for the late queen and explained that the robe had never been intentionally hidden to conceal it. Her explanation helped clarify any misunderstandings and reinforced the idea that the misplacement had been accidental rather than intentional. By speaking with staff and participating in discussions about storage and preservation, she demonstrated a commitment to protecting the palace's history and ensuring that such situations would not recur. Her involvement added a sense of unity to the palace staff, emphasizing cooperation and shared responsibility. For Bennett, the experience had also deepened his appreciation for the human stories behind the artifacts. Each item had been handled by someone, preserved by someone, and occasionally misplaced by someone. The palace's history was not only in the objects themselves, but also in the people who cared for them. His careful, patient search had bridged the gap between past and present, connecting him directly with the late Queen's legacy and the dedication of those who had served before him. It was a reminder that history is not just written in books or displayed in museums. It lives in the careful hands and attentive minds of those entrusted with its protection. The palace staff, inspired by the recovery of the coronation robe, began paying closer attention to all items in their care. Daily routines now included small checks to ensure that every artifact, garment, and accessory was properly stored. The hidden compartment where the robe had been found was studied and noted, along with any other unusual spaces that might have been overlooked. Staff members began taking pride in these small acts of diligence, knowing that their attention preserved not only the physical objects, but also the stories, memories, and legacies those objects represented. Over time, the coronation robe became more than just a garment. It became a story that staff and visitors would recount. Its journey from a hidden compartment back to secure storage symbolized the palace's dedication to history, the value of careful observation, and the importance of human attention to detail. Bennett often found himself explaining the process to new staff, describing how subtle clues in the closet had led to the robe's discovery. His stories inspired others to approach their work with curiosity, patience, and respect, reinforcing the idea that preservation is a collaborative effort. The robes and ceremonial items recovered alongside the coronation garment were also carefully documented and preserved. Each piece, whether worn during a grand event or a smaller family ceremony, held historical significance. Their recovery highlighted the intricate care required to maintain a palace full of centuries-old items. Bennett's careful handling, along with the improved procedures developed after the investigation, ensured that these treasures would remain safe and accessible for future generations. In reflecting on the entire process, Bennett realized that the story of the coronation robe was about more than the physical recovery of a garment. It was a story of patience, diligence, and respect for history. It was about understanding that mistakes happen, but can be corrected with careful attention. It was about appreciating the human effort behind every artifact and recognizing that preserving history requires both skill and empathy. And it was about connecting the present to the past, ensuring that the legacy of the late queen and the traditions of the palace would continue for generations to come. By the time the coronation robe and related items were fully secured, the palace had learned valuable lessons. Staff members were more attentive, procedures were more robust, and everyone understood that history is preserved not by chance but by careful, consistent effort. The discovery had sparked renewed respect for the palace's treasures and the people responsible for maintaining them. It had reminded everyone that even in a place as grand as the royal residence, the smallest details matter. For Bennett, the conclusion of the search and investigation brought a quiet sense of closure. He had navigated tension, uncertainty, and responsibility with patience and care. The coronation robe, once hidden and nearly forgotten, was now safe, preserved, and accounted for. The palace's history was intact, and the lessons learned from the experience would guide future generations of staff. It was a victory not just for him, but for the legacy of the royal household, demonstrating that history can be protected when diligence, respect, and careful attention are applied. As days turned into weeks, the story of the coronation robe became a point of reflection rather than scandal. Staff members shared their experiences, emphasizing teamwork, attention to detail, and the importance of safeguarding the past. Visitors and historians who learned about the robe's journey were reminded that history is often fragile and must be treated with care. The palace had not only recovered a priceless artifact, but had also strengthened its ability to protect all its treasures, ensuring that the legacy of the late queen would continue to inspire and educate. In the end, the discovery and recovery of the coronation robe highlighted the importance of patience, observation, and respect for history. Bennett's meticulous search had preserved a vital piece of the royal legacy, while the investigation and improved procedures ensured that the palace could prevent similar oversights in the future. The coronation robe stood as a symbol of both history and human dedication, a reminder that even the most valuable treasures require careful attention, respect, and the vigilance of those entrusted with their care. And so, the palace returned to its quiet rhythm, its halls filled with echoes of history and the footsteps of diligent staff. The coronation robe, once hidden, now rested safely in its rightful place, preserved for generations to admire. Bennett continued his work with the same patience and care he had always shown, knowing that the smallest actions often have the greatest impact. The story of the robe became a lasting lesson, a tale of responsibility, vigilance, and respect for history, a story that would be remembered in the palace for years to come.